Welcome back. In this lecture, lecture number 4 on the road to World War II, we're going to try something new. You see my face there recording in the bottom. I thought this might be a little bit better for you. I'm not sure. We'll see how this goes. But the question and topic and purpose of today's lecture is, what was the position of the United States regarding the dramatic events of the 1930s in the world? And we really want to try to zero in on, we know that the world fell apart. We know that there was the death of democracy in the 1930s. What's the position of the United States? In other words, does the United States have a position? What's its role? What do we think our role is? And that's what we're going to try to investigate in today's lecture, lecture number 4. So here it goes. So what we need to do is, again, remember the backdrop of the Great Depression. The national government focused most of its energy on curing the effects of the Depression, as seen in the programs of the New Deal, passed by Congress and signed into law by President Roosevelt. And I think that's a really good thing to remember. The American people were consumed with the misery, the suffering, not having jobs, food, money, etc. And the national federal government, that is, was dedicated to trying to bring relief and reform to help the American people. So at the very same time the world falls apart, the United States finds itself caught in the grip of this depression that is crushing the United States, crushing the spirit of the people. However, nonetheless, the American people and Congress were not blind to the events that were occurring in Asia and Europe. We saw already that the Stimson Doctrine is an example of this, where the United States is going to condemn Japanese aggression in China in particular. There's another example, and that is the senator that you see pictured here in the screen. This is Senator Gerald Nye of Nebraska. And Senator Nye was an influential senator on the Foreign Relations Committee, and he launched an inquiry into the causes of World War I in the middle of the 1930s. And so it's a historical study, if you will, of why did the United States really get involved in World War I. Now you have to go back and remember all of that history, right? So in brief, we felt that, at least President Wilson felt that at the time, German U-boats were sinking American ships, destroying American goods, making travel difficult for Americans, and in some cases killing Americans. So that was one thing. The Zimmerman Note was another thing. So Senator Nye really set out to investigate why Wilson took the United States to war, why Congress agreed with that war declaration. And the results of his inquiry were really quite simple. And Senator Nye concluded, after extensive study and looking at charts and data, economic data in particular, that the United States really entered World War I for economic reasons. That is, to make the industrial owners and bankers wealthier and richer. And that was his conclusion. And so what came out of this investigation was what is known as the Nye thesis, and that's called what historians have called the Merchants of Death thesis. And this really explains why the United States got into war. Now, you might ask, well, why is this important now in the middle of the 1930s, Mr. King? This doesn't really seem to be all that important. The war was over in 1918. This is some 18, almost 20 years in the past. But really what it says is it questions the reasons the United States got involved in the war. We have to remember that Wilson presented the war as a just war to defend the rights of democracy, the rights of free people, and to spread democracy throughout the world, in fact, to make the world safe for democracy. Therefore, our war intervention would seem justified and a good thing to promote spread democracy throughout the world. Senator Nye comes back with his report and says it was not about democracy and spreading democracy throughout the world. It was to make American bankers and factory owners wealthier. Therefore, we should not get involved in the events that were going on in Asia and in Europe at the time. So that's the idea that Nye put together, and it was a very influential idea for this next very reason. The United States, as the world starts to spin and spiral out of control, is going to declare officially neutrality, and that is the United States Congress that makes laws is going to pass a series of what are known as Neutrality Acts in 1935, in 1936, 1937, and again in 1939. So again, I think the question is a simple one. What is the pattern that you see? What pattern do we discern? The idea of neutrality. And in fact, these Neutrality Acts were designed to make illegal the sale of weapons to nations at war or involved in wars, the lending of money to nations engaged in wars, so that the United States was not going to lend money as it had done in World War I to belligerent nations to purchase weapons. So that is going to be illegal. And also the idea of travel by United States citizens on ships of nations at war is going to be illegal. You might remember the story of the Lusitania, a British passenger liner on which 128 Americans lost their lives as it was sunk by a German submarine in a war zone. So Congress did what it felt was needed to do to keep the United States safe, protected from world affairs that were rapidly spiraling out of control, as we saw in lectures 2 and 3, events involving Japan and China, events involving Italy and Ethiopia, events involving Nazi Germany and Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, later on Poland. So we can see that there's a real trend going on, the Spanish Civil War, and the United States and its Congress now. And this is also interesting because now Congress is taking the lead, not the president. And you might say, well, why did President Roosevelt kind of go along with this? And again, I think the answer is the Great Depression. Roosevelt was more concerned with the Great Depression than he was necessarily with world affairs. He did not want to offend Congress. All right, so the idea of Neutrality Acts, and you can see these posters here, all out aid to our allies. There's an American ship that's kind of circling on itself. That is, it's not traveling anywhere. It's not really bringing aid to anybody. So there's a sense of irony that you see in this political cartoon. And then you see this sort of like almost bumper sticker or patch, keep U.S. out of war, be neutral. And then in the box, I'll let you guys read, providing for the prohibition of the export of arms, ammunition, implements of war to belligerent countries. So that's actually wording from the Neutrality Act. So it's a legal language. It's rather thick and dense, but I think you get the idea. So moving on, as times changed in Europe, so too did the Neutrality Acts. Remember, there were 4 of them that were passed. And on November 5th, 1939, and we have to remember that the war actually began in Europe on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, we see Congress passing the Neutrality Act of 1939, and this time there's a change, a significant change, and this was something that President Roosevelt had demanded, had really pushed Congress to give him, and this was the idea of cash and carry. Whereas previous Neutrality Acts had forbidden the sale of arms to countries at war, this Neutrality Act said anybody who wants to come to the United States, pick up goods, and take them back to their own country on their ships can do so, provided they pay cash for them. So there's no lending, there's no credit involved. It is countries can come to the United States with their ships, buy things, if they pay cash, take them back to their countries. Now this was clearly designed to aid Britain, that had the largest navy in the world, and the most powerful navy that could protect its ships, and Britain was facing, by 1939, the threat of Nazi Germany. And we're going to get into the timeline of Nazi Germany and its war efforts. But remember that war began on September 1st, 1939. Congress acts to promote the idea of cash and carry November 5th, 1939. So here's a big shift in policy. And it shows that Roosevelt has been successful in convincing the American people that they ought to take seriously the threat around the world. And Roosevelt really never liked the neutrality laws. He felt that they kind of hemmed him in and prevented him from being an effective leader in a time of great crisis. So this is going to be a significant change in U.S. policy. Now, what about public opinions in the United States? This is an interesting question that we want to look at. And what we're going to do is what you see there on the right-hand side in that picture is actually one of the early polls. So opinion polls come into existence in the 1930s, in the early 1930s. An organization named Gallup, among others, but Gallup is still one of the great polling organizations today, some 80 years later, began to ask questions of the American people. And you can see that in 1938, October 2nd, the question there, if England and France go to war against Germany, do you think the United States can stay out? And you can see the opinion of the American people. 57% of the American people say yes. 43% say no. So clearly the idea of neutrality was something that was prevalent, dominant among the American people. The idea that we were committed to non-intervention, to neutrality. Yes, we wanted to help, but we did not want to get involved directly again, as had occurred in World War I. And again, why didn't the United States want to get involved again in war? Well, wars are nasty affairs. They're costly affairs, and they're deadly affairs. And the United States, again, based on the Nye Commission, felt that World War I was the result of bankers and industrialists trying to get rich themselves while sacrificing the lives of millions of young Americans. So what I'd like you to do here is slightly different, but I'd like you to stop the lecture, and I'd like you to look up, using Safari and your iPads, the Gallup polls relating to public opinion about the events in Europe 1938, 1939, and 1940, and then write those down and bring those to class. But I think this is the interesting thing, that President Roosevelt's concerned about the affairs in the world, yet the American people remain committed to non-intervention and neutrality. So the president has a problem. And that raises the next point that I want to make, and that is this constitutional question. So you see here on the right in the top an image of We the People. That's the Constitution of the United States. You see down below the Capitol building, the legislative branch, and then the White House, the executive branch. So what does the Constitution say about war? So we need to remember back to our government class when we were freshmen, if possible. Who does have the power to declare war? The president or Congress? Okay, so I think that it's clear that the Constitution, if we don't remember, the Constitution states in Article 1, Section 8, and clauses, I forget, maybe 9 and 10, that Congress has the sole power to declare war. The president is the commander-in-chief and will command the troops once a war is declared, but the president does not himself have the power to declare war. So that then raises the question, what could President Roosevelt have done differently in the 1930s? Roosevelt was very concerned about world affairs. He knew what Nazi Germany was up to. He did not like and trust Hitler, Mussolini, or Tojo in Japan, yet he was bound and limited by the Constitution, especially because Congress had passed these neutrality laws stating clearly to the American people and to the world that the United States intended to remain neutral. So what could he have done? What would you have done if you were in President Roosevelt's shoes? It's an interesting question. All right, so having solved or looked at least at the constitutional question that really kind of limited President Roosevelt, what was really going on in Europe and the war? So the war begins, as we know, in 1939. Germany defeated Poland within a matter of 3 weeks. September 1, 1939, the invasion begins using blitzkrieg, that is using planes and following up by tanks, mechanized troops, and 3 weeks Poland falls. After that, something curious happens. There's what's called, not the phone war, I'm sorry, that should be the phony war with a Y, the phony war from October 1939 to April 1940. And some historians refer to it using the German word, which is Sitzkrieg, and that means literally sitting war. That is, really, there's no fighting going on. And this kind of surprised everybody. Everybody had thought that Hitler would waste no time in just sort of rolling over large swaths of Europe, but he doesn't. He waits, consolidates his forces, and then in April of 1940, Hitler unleashes what I call the dogs of war. And again, that would be the planes, the tanks that you see there. And you can see the New York Times headline, "The Nazis invade Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg by land and air. Dikes opened, Allies rush in." Later, Denmark and Norway are going to be attacked. And so really, most of Western Europe now, by the end of April 1940, has fallen to Nazi hands. The last country standing would be France, and France was going to put up a defense and a fight, but yet France was too going to be defeated by the middle of June 1940. France is in the control of the Nazis. So that leaves, really, in Europe, Britain alone. Now, Britain, thankfully, is an island. So while Hitler would have loved to have invaded directly, Hitler did not possess the naval strength necessary to amass his troops and transfer them across the English Channel to invade England by land, because the English had such a powerful navy. So that's something that Hitler is not able to do. So Hitler launches what's known as the Battle for Britain from May of 1940 to October of 1940, and this consisted of massive waves of German bombers dropping bombs on military and strategic installations in England.